This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so for the benefit of the recorded conference, we are looking at Revelation, and we're taking the Old Testament background of particularly Daniel and Zechariah to examine that. So just continuing on from that theme of Jesus quoting from Daniel in the Olivet prophecy in Matthew 24, I just wanted to establish the importance of the prophets to the apostles in the first century ecclesia by taking a reading from Acts 3, and beginning at verse 20. We'll read from 20 through to verse 25. And it says, "You shall send Jesus Christ, which before was preached unto you, whom heaven must receive until the times of restitution of all things, which God spoke by the mouth of all his holy prophets since the world began. For Moses truly said unto the fathers, A prophet shall your Lord God raise up to you of your brethren, like unto me, and ye shall hear in all him ye shall hear in all things whatsoever he shall say unto you. And it shall come to pass that every soul which will not hear that prophet shall be destroyed from among the people. Yea, and all the prophets from Samuel and those that follow after, as many as have spoken, have likewise foretold of these days. Ye are the children of the prophets and of the covenant which God made with our fathers, saying unto Abraham, In thy seed shall all kindreds of the earth be blessed. And I think that's a good foundation for encapsulating what the prophets were about and what their message was about. And so you can put Revelation into that same sort of context. It's about Jesus Christ and his work, and there's some important features in that which come out in the prophets, and one of those features is not just the fulfillment of the promises to Abraham and Israel, but also that fundamental blessing which Abraham first received, which is, in thee shall all kindreds of the earth be blessed, okay, which, remember, was the blessing ahead of Abraham actually receiving the blessing himself. So when you look at that, and you can find this consistently throughout the New Testament, Acts chapter 28 and verse 23 has that same context. It's both the law and the prophets, which are important. We start to see the importance of this, and I think the importance of Daniel is also particularly shown, for me anyway, in Matthew 26. Matthew 26 is, of course, Jesus on trial. And when Jesus was on trial, if we have to go right the way down to verse 64, we know that Jesus spake not a word. He kept quiet. They were trying to indict him, and they didn't have anything to use against him. So then the high priest said, well, I want you to answer a question then, are you the Son of God? Okay, so that's the one time that Jesus spoke. And it says, Jesus had said unto him, Thou hast said, Nevertheless I say unto you, hereafter you shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. And we sometimes race past that without noting that that's actually Daniel that he's talking about there. So that comes from Daniel chapter 7 and verse 13. that also then comes out again in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 7. It then has the same idea again in Revelation 14 and verse 14. But if you want to go right the way back to the origins of that, I guess you could say the origins of that is actually in Deuteronomy 33 and verse 26. And that you can follow these themes through Scripture from the beginning to the end, just as it says there in Acts, and follow the words which are important in Revelation. And you've got a codex, if you like, for trying to interpret a lot of the book as you go through. And so in our chapter here, it talks about some similarities about, I guess, Daniel and the Apostle John. And the similarity is, of course, that both of them were captives under a very powerful state. Daniel was captive to Babylon. He actually had quite a bit of power and influence over the state, but nonetheless he was captive to it. And he could not escape from that captivity that he was under, in spite of holding positions of great power within the land. And it's notable too that Daniel's positions of power transcended the change of kingdoms, because that his governmental position didn't directly transfer with him, but it was noted his ability and capability. And so therefore under Darius, he was also still in the same position essentially of government in the land. Nonetheless, still a captive. And I guess there's a little bit of a type in that, I guess, for ourselves about the way we should view ourselves. And the same thing was for John. John was a captive of Rome. Now we can say, oh yeah, but John wasn't in a position of power. But we do know what happened with the church as it proceeded through further in time in the Roman Empire, that the church became in a position of power within the state. Okay, so there is quite a bit of similarity to that way the captivity changed to the captives having quite an influence of power in time. I guess it's important to note that the message of Daniel is not repeated in Revelation, but the prophetic symbols and signs would have been quite recognizable to the Christians in their reuse. And so we put up the chart there, and I think most people are going to recognize Nebuchadnezzar's image. And you've got the development. I mean, I don't think anyone here would not comprehend Nebuchadnezzar's image. It's fairly straightforward to interpret, okay, because it's interpreted for us. And so you have the successive kingdoms that come down through there. And then the pattern of the book of Daniel is that it then develops those further out. So you have the animals and the beasts, okay, and then you have the pictures of the horns. I wanted to get a way you know the story of the ram and the goat and the horns which sprout. And obviously that pattern of interpretation has to come through to Revelation, because we have the horns typifying things also in Revelation, plus a whole lot more. So I don't really want to try and go through the book of Daniel, because we're then going to be changing it to a Daniel study rather than a Revelation study. I'd rather leave that up to you if you don't think you're at home yet with exactly what Daniel means. I'm not saying that Daniel is all an easy study, but there's a lot of stuff out there which people have gone through history and noted the accuracy of how that all pans out. But there are some very important words. So what I do want to go to is Daniel chapter 10. I'll just deal with Daniel chapter 10 and Daniel chapter 12 and some of the things which come out in there. So Daniel chapter 10, and Daniel actually labels the visions or dreams that he has with how they pertain to which king was in power at the time, which is kind of helpful because it gives us some chronology of when he received the visions or dreams. But I want to note particularly verse 1 and verse 14 there. Okay, so it says, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a thing was revealed unto Daniel, whose name was called Belshazzar. The thing was true, but the time appointed was long, and he understood the thing and had understanding of the vision. And if we skip down to verse 14, it says there, now I am come to make thee understand what shall befall thy people in the latter days, for yet the vision is for many days. So Daniel received a whole lot of things which I guess were fulfilled by the time, largely, okay, a lot of them were fulfilled by the time John was now recording the revelation he received. Okay, but Daniel was given to understand that this was a long game, that he was not going to see all the fulfillment of the visions that he had seen and understood, that they were for a long period of time. And it's quite important to note that as a feature of Daniel and his revelation, because the same thing, therefore, is what we can apply to Revelation. Okay, so you will have in the earlier chapters gone through the various interpretations of Daniel, okay, and the interpretation which thinks it all was fulfilled at the time of Christ in AD 70, and then the continuous historic perspective of the study that comes out here, which says it's a continuous fulfillment of Revelation, which is happening down through time. Both sides, I think, would all accept that the end part of Revelation is accepted. Obviously, that cannot be classed as fulfilled in anyone's terms, because there's no way you could interpret that to be so. New Jerusalem definitely has not arrived. So it is interesting, though, to see some of the transfer of the ideas from Daniel, how they almost directly transfer, but with different interpretation, into Revelation. And I'm not about trying to interpret any of this, but really just to show you the connection. So while we're in Daniel, let's just skip over to chapter 12. And it's still that same idea about, it's a long time, okay, but Daniel gets some time given to him in chapter 12. So verse 7, it says, and I heard that man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand unto heaven, and swear by him that liveth forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and an half. And when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. So that's one of the features of Daniel, is it gives some time periods to be understood. Okay, and that directly transfers almost word for word into Revelation. There's another one in Daniel and verse 11, which before we get out of Daniel, let's just note, it says, from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Okay, now if we then skip through to Revelation, let's just spend a little bit of time around chapter 12 of Revelation and chapter 11 of Revelation. So in chapter 12, verse 14, we have the picture of the woman, okay, the woman who's brought forth a man-child. And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the face of the serpent. So exact same language. If we're getting the same language, it makes sense then that the way we apply interpretations is that already familiar way in which the brethren of John would have already known and interpreted the prophecy. If we go to chapter 12 and earlier, verse 5 and 6, now it's not exactly the same time period, okay. It says, and she brought forth a man-child who was to rule the nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up unto God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her for 1,260 days. So it's 90 days now, so it's 1,260. But it's that same, pattern of using numerical time periods, which the reader is supposed to interpret. And that same number that's quoted there in Revelation comes again, not again, it comes prior in Revelation chapter 11. And we get one of the other visions, I guess, if you like, from the Old Testament in there, but it's that same time period again. And starting at verse 3, it says, I'll give power to my 2 witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 candlesticks standing before the God of the earth. So you got that time period again. The time period now is applied to something else. So where have you heard of the 2 olive trees and the 2 candles? Well, it's not 2 candlesticks, but the 2 olive trees either side of a candlestick. Where have you heard that from? Zechariah. Yeah, for sure. Which chapter? I'm going to go chapter 4, just to help you out, save time. Zechariah chapter 4. Let's go back to Zechariah, because Zechariah is the other one that we are dealing with in here, and two of the prophets which have almost verbatim language, I guess, used out of there, even though the interpretation is different. And I stress that, okay, that doesn't mean that it's talking about the same thing. It's just using recognizable language, okay, that the people can understand. Okay, and we you change this by the enter.
This conference will now be recorded.
Sorry for recording your conference again. I'm just trying to figure out what buttons I need to press to swap my next slide. I've tried the arrows. Press enter, then it might stop recording the thing. Right, it's not Thank you, Andrew, for your technical prowess on a computer I'm not familiar with. Okay, so this chart is from earlier in the book, and therefore, if you were here for that session, you will recognise it. It's just a chart of some of the symbols, okay, which are used, and the interpretation of what they mean. Okay, it's by no means complete by any stretch of imagination, but we have a lot of things which are code in there, and they can be interpreted. There's not too much argument about that or being able to interpret them if you're familiar with them. So Zechariah is where we were heading. Zechariah chapter 4 to start with. Okay. In Zechariah, we have the picture of the olive trees and the lamb. So let's start at verse 2. It says, "And he said unto me, What seest thou? And I said, I have looked, and behold, a candlestick all of gold, with a bowl on the top of it, and his 7 lamps thereon, and 7 pipes to the 7 lamps which are on top thereof, and 2 olive trees by it, one upon the right side of the bowl, and the other upon the left side thereof." And when we go down a bit further to verse 14, okay, we get the interpretation. Okay, then he said, "These are the 2 anointed ones that stand by the Lord of the whole earth." Now, who was Zechariah talking to? Zechariah was talking to the people who had returned from captivity from Babylon. Okay, and the two witnesses is I don't remember their names. You've got of course Joshua, okay, because that we're familiar with that being also a prophecy of Jesus, the prophecy of the branch. Just trying to remember the Zerubbabel. Okay, so Zerubbabel and Joshua. Okay, and the picture that we've got between these two is a picture of the throne, okay, and then a picture of the priesthood. and that's the two olive trees. Okay, and they're standing each side of the candlestick. What does the candlestick represent? Ecclesia. Yeah, you're already familiar with this. That hasn't changed from this time. The candlestick is representing, Israel as the ecclesia, and then when we come down through to the New Testament, the candlestick or the light stand, okay, also represents the ecclesia. In the early pages of Revelation, it's representing the 7 ecclesias, okay, but it doesn't always just represent the true ecclesia, okay, because the ecclesia got corrupted, remember, under the influence of the Roman Empire. So it also has this ecclesiastical term to it. So by the time we get to Revelation chapter 11, okay, it's not particularly talking about the ecclesia there. It's talking about pseudo-ecclesia, okay, something purporting to be an ecclesia, okay, but corrupted, okay, and the prophets there, they're not particularly, I guess if we go back to Revelation chapter 11 would probably be the most helpful. So in Revelation chapter 11, okay, if you look through the early chapters of Zechariah, it talks about the measuring line, okay, and then when we get to Revelation chapter 11, okay, we read in the first verse, it says he was given a reed like unto a rod, and then he was asked to go and measure the temple. Okay, that's the first instance that we get that we've got these connotations coming from Zechariah here. Okay, and when we get down to verse 4, dealing with these candlesticks, it says, these are the 2 olive trees and the 2 candlesticks standing before the God of the earth. Okay. Well, there you go. Okay, standing before God, right? But you've got to be careful with your terms, because what is it? It says it's the God of the earth, right? But we're children of the God of heaven. Okay, and later on you'll get that that term later on in this this chapter in verse 13. Okay, it says, same hour there was a great earthquake, 10th part of the city fell, the earthquake slam men 7,000, remnant were affrighted and gave glory to the God of heaven. So you do have to be careful with your terminology when you're going through Revelation, because it gets a bit mixed up. God of the earth is not the same as the God of heaven. God of heaven is the true God, okay? God of the earth is someone who's trying to stand in God's place. And you get the same thing if you're following Jerusalem, for example. So we're all citizens of Zion. That means we're citizens of Jerusalem, not necessarily in Revelation, okay, because Jerusalem is corrupt too. So we're citizens of heavenly Jerusalem, okay, and that comes through in even the likes of Hebrew, where we look for a city whose maker is God. Okay, so you do have to pay attention to terms and terminology, because it will use that terminology of the situation that has developed in the world. And we've got to remember that Rome became merged with the church down the track, so that for the uneducated it was hard to distinguish between the truth of the gospel, true believers, and those who followed a false system, those who had had fornicated themselves with the harlot, as it became to be known. And so those are just some things to be aware of when you're looking through Revelation. Zechariah chapter 6, we have the picture of the branch, okay, and the unifying of the throne with the priesthood. We're very familiar with that for Jesus, because we know that's what has happened under Jesus, that the throne and the priesthood are united. And that's why we get the picture of heaven set out like the tabernacle or the temple, okay, because there's that picture of unity between priesthood and throne. And that's the role of Jesus, therefore. He's king and priest. Zechariah chapter 1 also has reference to the horns of the nations. Okay, so we can take that term horns and we can understand that that has reference to nations or rulers over those nations. Okay, and that's where you get the different numbers of horns growing out of horns, and all of that sort of carry on. But we can decipher it by having been back to the Old Testament prophets, who have already given us some deciphering there. Now, it's not just Zechariah, Daniel and Zechariah, which have the references. We find that there's lots of different references through other prophets as well, and I'm kind of skipping ahead here because we already started behind time and haven't really made up time. So let's take one out of Isaiah. Isaiah 41 and verse 4. All right, we're cutting into everything out of context because we're not dealing with context here, we're dealing with words. Who hath wrought and done it, calling the generations from the beginning, I the Lord, the first with the last, I am he. Now that comes out in the beginning of Revelation, doesn't it? For identifying the first and the last. Isaiah has that sort of a reference 4 times. It also comes out in 43 verse 10, 44 verse 6, 48 verse 12. Okay, the Lord, the first and the last. Okay, so by the time we get to Revelation, it's not something new. It's something which is familiar to those who knew their prophets. Isaiah 60, okay, and verse 19 to 20. That's why we're in Isaiah. The sun shall be no more, thy light by day, neither for brightness shall the moon give light unto thee, but the Lord shall be unto thee an everlasting light, and thy God thy glory. The sun shall no more go down, neither shall thy moon withdraw itself, for the Lord shall be thine everlasting light, and the days of thy mourning shall be ended. And so what do we get when we get to the end of Revelation? We get that exact same terminology, that there's no need anymore for the sun, for the Lord himself is the light of New Jerusalem. So all of these are based back down through history in the prophets, and they're for those who are familiar with it, are just themes which are recognizable to them and coming out again in the prophecy of Revelation. Okay, and you've got all of the other references which I'm not dealing with at all, of the temple and the tabernacle illustrating heaven, because we did delve a little bit on that in brief last time. But there are also a lot of traces, I guess, in the New Testament language, okay, which can also be helpful for us in understanding this didn't just come with the book of Revelation. When we look, we realize we're already familiar with a lot of things there. Okay, so one of the things is the reference to the woman, okay, in Revelation. So what does the woman represent in Revelation? So we read Revelation chapter 12, and it talked about the woman who had a child, okay, and then she was taken to the desert. And what does the woman? Yeah, okay. And so we're kind of already familiar with that. We refer a lot to the bride of Christ, but let's take a look at 2 John chapter 2. Second John chapter 2, or is that First John chapter 2? Must be First John chapter 2. I think that probably is not supposed to be any chapter 2 at all. I'm pretty sure it's probably going to be 2 John. Yeah, 2 John. Get the chapter 2. That's just what happens when you're writing things down late at night. So 2 John, and we only have one chapter. So look at verse 1. The elder unto the elect lady and her children, whom I love in the truth. Okay, so we have the elect lady. Let's go down to the end of 2 John 1, verse 13. The children of thy elect sister greet thee. Amen. So it doesn't take much imagination to understand that John's talking about different ecclesias there. Okay, but that terminology, elect lady, okay, it's terms which I think have developed, particularly, I guess they would develop under persecution, wouldn't they? Where you don't want to have anything in writing which isn't somewhat codified in case it falls into the wrong hands. Okay, and so they had these codes which they referred to themselves by and used. Okay, so that's one of them. But let's look at Peter, because one of the things I've always struggled with, maybe a little bit less now that I've done this study, is Babylon in Revelation. Anyone else struggled with Babylon in Revelation? Just me. What does Babylon represent in Revelation? Evil kingdoms of men? Let's make this easy. Babylon was a city, and the name transfers through to another city. So what city? Rome. Okay, well, you believe it's Rome. What about some people actually believe it's Jerusalem? So what do we know about Babylon from Revelation? It's actually codified for us. This is one of the ones which is actually interpreted later in Revelation. But even in spite of it being interpreted, it's a little bit confusing. We interpret it to be Rome because it sits on 7 hills, was the interpretation for it. Okay, and Rome is well known to have been built on 7 hills. But apparently, believe it or not, so was Jerusalem, built on 7 hills. So that doesn't get much help now, does it, for those who believe in the preterist interpretation of Revelation? They believe it was Jerusalem, and you can still fit that into it. Okay, so I want to just go through and see that, being familiar with also what the epistles written by the apostles codify for us, can also be helpful as the Old Testament prophecies. So let us go to 2 Peter and chapter 5. 2 Peter chapter 5. 1 Peter, sorry, chapter 5. Sitting you all over the show to fictional chapters. Apologies. Okay, so chapter 5 and verse 13. This is Peter closing off, okay? He says, start at verse 12, by Silvanus, a faithful brother unto you, as I suppose I have written briefly, exhorting and testifying that this is the true grace of God wherein ye stand. The church that is at Babylon, elected together with you, saluteth you, and so doth Marcus my son. Greet each other with a kiss of love. Okay, peace be to all you that are in Christ. Okay, so the church that is at Babylon, elected together with you. Great, Peter. Now, where were you? Okay, so Peter, we understand him to be the head of the church at Jerusalem, don't we? So it's not getting much more helpful at the moment, is it? But if you want to go down a real rabbit hole, okay, he includes another term in there, okay? So doth Marcus my son. Who's Marcus? John Mark. Okay, great. Well, we've got another name now. We can start tracing John Mark, okay? So Acts chapter 12, verse 12, we know that very early on, they used to meet at the house of John Mark's mother. Okay, when Peter came out of prison in Jerusalem, that's where he went to, remember? And they answered the door in a well-known Sunday school story. Don't need to tell you about that. Okay, well, that was the house of Mary, who was the mother of Mark. Those details are recorded for us. Okay, Colossians 4, verse 10, 11, we learn of Mark being the cousin of Barnabas. Okay, what do we know about Colossians? Well, we know that Colossians was written from Rome. Okay, if we go to 2 Timothy 4, verse 11, Paul is writing, get Mark and bring him. Okay, where was Paul? Paul was imprisoned in Rome. If quite a change around, because if you remember that Barnabas and Paul had a falling out over the fact that when they wanted to go on their missionary journey again, Barnabas wanted to take Mark, but Paul didn't want it because he ran away the other time. Okay, change of heart from Paul. He wants Mark to be brought to him in Rome. Okay, and then Philemon, also written while Paul's the prisoner, because he says he's a prisoner, he sends greetings from Mark. And then when you get into some of the early church writers, they say that 1 Peter was written from Rome. Okay, so there is other ways that you can sort of established. So I've gone from being quite unsure about being able to determine what Babylon was, to now feeling a bit more secure in that traditional interpretation that Babylon is referring to Rome. Okay, just by doing a little bit of a deep dive on some of the New Testament background. So I just put that out there because that you can use the whole of Scripture to try and help interpret Revelation for you. I don't like to get dogmatic about Revelation interpretations because that, good luck to the person who says they know everything about everything for Revelation. We are just doing our best to decipher a coded revelation, a coded prophecy. So our chapter here finishes with the blessings, okay, because Daniel in chapter 12, where we're at, has the blessing, and so this is the lead-in, if you like, to the end section of our chapter. So we should read it. Daniel chapter 12. Okay, Daniel's asking what will be the end of these things. Okay, Daniel really wants to know. Okay, he's given this dialogue, okay, about go thy way, Daniel, for the words closed and sealed till the time of the end. He's basically told you don't get to know Daniel. That's for the people at the time of the end. They'll recognize it. Okay, but it ends with a blessing in verse 12. Okay, blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1,305 and 30 days. But to Daniel, go thou thy way till the end be, for thou shalt rest and stand in thy lot at the end of the days. Okay, so there's a blessing to he who waits, and that same blessing, we have 7 of them in Revelation, 7 blessings. Okay, so just reading straight from our book here. Blessing number 1, the blessing of the message, Revelation 1 verse 3. Blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of this prophecy and keep those things which are written in it, for the time is near. Number 2, the blessing of hope, and this is from Revelation 14 and verse 13. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on, that they may rest from their labours and their works follow them. Number 3, the blessing of watching, chapter 16 verse 15. Behold, I am coming as a thief. Blessed is he who watches and keeps his garments, lest he walk naked, and they shall see his shame. Once again, that's a reference from Jesus' teachings, isn't it? That we can see directly quoted there. Blessing number 4, the blessing of the call. Blessed are those, this is from chapter 19, verse 9. Blessed are those who are called to the marriage supper of the Lamb. Blessing number 5, the blessing of immortality, from chapter 20 and verse 6. Blessed and holy is he who has part in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they shall be priests of God and of Christ, and shall reign with him 1,000 years. Number 6, blessing number 6, the blessing of obedience, from chapter 22 and verse 7. Behold, I am coming quickly. Blessed is he who keeps the words of the prophecy of this book. And blessing number 7, the blessing of the kingdom. Blessed are those who do his commandments, that they may have the right to the tree of life, and may enter through the gates into the city. Verse 14. It says the last blessing in Revelation mentions God's faithful people entering into the city. The book deals with 2 cities. One is the city of God, the other is the city of man. because of the connection with Daniel and the Old Testament passages, the city of man is called Babylon. God's city is called New Jerusalem. The story of these two cities is the subject of the next chapter. So there you go. Just to excite you about the study for next time. Tale of two cities, Babylon and Jerusalem. So, anyone want to have any comments very quickly? I should probably learn how to stop this recording. Just press enter, does that work? Nope, that ended the slideshow this time.